This is an ancient landscape of salt marshes, mud banks, isolated creeks and scattered communities. It stretches from tiny Shepherdine in the north to the bustling environments of Avonmouth and Shirehampton to the south. Walking through this land, you might be forgiven for thinking that nothing has changed for generations, but in reality much has. For 2 years, a group of volunteers has been collecting memories in order to link the lower Seven Vales past with the present. We've recorded the voices of some 50 people as they reflect on their lives. Now we invite you to sit back and listen. You'll hear from teenagers to those in their 90s, all speaking from the heart about growing up, living and working in this forgotten landscape. You'll be guided through their stories by me, Julian Baldwin, and my fellow volunteer Felicity Pine.
Let's start with some of the earliest memories we recorded. Accounts of growing up in villages along the Severn, where little had changed in generations. You'll hear from John Allway, Joyce Tivenham, Alfred Till and Kath Allway.
I was born in Gloucestershire, lived in Gloucestershire all my life, moved 300 yards from where I was born. That's it. Our travels, going back to when I was young, sort of 4 or 5 years of age, Severn Beach was our Sunday school outing. Now that was travelling, horse and cart, Severn Beach. And then one year we went to Chepstow. Well, how big is the world? Now come on. No, Ulster was our world.
The village, when I was young, you knew everybody. When we were walking or riding our bicycles, if we saw somebody we knew, we stopped and we talked to them. But now it's all cars and you don't. You just drive straight through.
I can remember when I first went to school and there used to be a van pick us kids up, and they used to stop at the different farms on the way to school and pick up salmon that they caught the night before. You would be sat on the van and the salmon baskets would be up in the middle, Sometimes you used to have crates of apples on there, or a small barrel of cider, all going up to Bristol Market, you see.
You knew everybody and everybody knew everybody else. And you played with everybody. There was no, I'm a bit better than you or anything like that as children. There was a lady in the village called Miss Fowler, and she used to make wine. So she used to take me up the fields, up towards the cliff, to pick dandelions and cowslips for her to make wine. And then her sister used to pick blackberries for my dad. I used to go with her down the lanes to pick blackberries, £1 of blackberries at a time.
Inextricably linked with memories of growing up in these tight-knit communities are dozens of stories of larking about by the water's edge. Here's Matthew Riddle, Jan Small, Christabel Timcoe and Lofty Daniels.
As a child, I would go and raid my mother's wardrobe and get a coat hanger and a pair of her tights and make a stickleback net and take my brother down to the Reens at Duckhole, where, because the Reens were very shallow and quite wide, you could spend half a morning getting sticklebacks out of the Reens. If you were very lucky, you might even get an eel, a small eel. And that just shows the difference, really, in the depths of the Reens now. You wouldn't be able to do that now because the Reens are so deep.
Never lived if you haven't been mudding in the river. Didn't do it very often, but we used to go with our skirts tucked up or shorts on or something and just go mudding, go walking out. Tide had been going out, so you followed it. You developed the art of pulling your foot out before it reached the bottom.
There is a particular way of walking with the mud. It's a bit like skiing. You have to keep your weight forward and keep your knees slightly bent and never stand still and just keep moving. And it helps if you're sort of skinny and fit and not particularly big. But, children don't have any problem, really. I suppose just to try and tie the tops of your wellies with bits of string, anything to stop the mud going down them, because once the mud gets into them, you couldn't really move.
When we started off, we were birds nesters, which everybody did then, collected birds' eggs. And we used to just wander. The Portbury Dock went there then, so we used to walk down that way. And there used to be a building which built concrete barges in the First War for the war effort. And the roof was all off, and we used to call it Jackdaw House. And then you have to climb right up on the things, and there's masses of jackdaws. So you got your jackdaw's eggs from there. Then you could walk down. Where Portbury Dock is, it was all reens and marshes, just full of ducks and everything else. But you could just walk, and everything was safe in those days. We used to spend a lot of time fishing all the way up.
In summer, there were opportunities to picnic by the Severn, sail on the estuary, or sample the delights of the holiday resort at Severn Beach. Here are the memories of Alan McCarthy, Mary Ace, Leon Franklin, Joyce Tibbenham, and Mary Jennings.
Severn Beach was quite popular in those days, and it had a very nice boating lake, which was fairly shallow. You hired a boat, and there were small islands in this large lake, and you could stop and hop on the island and pretend you were a pirate or whatever, hop off again.
Used to go down there to the swimming pool, the Blue Lagoon. And I mean, it was seawater, it wasn't fresh water, it was seawater that came in. And the Welsh people and the people from Birmingham used to love coming down here. And of course, living on the corner, I used to be up in the window watching them. And we used to have the turntable there where the trains used to turn round.
Sometimes we used to cycle down there. When they built the ICI factory, they built a new road through. Before that, to get to Severn Beach, you had to go down country lanes, which we used to cycle. Other times, we get the train down. There was a bit of a fun fair down there. Great day out, a really good day out. Lots of cafes. It was a holiday destination for people from the Midlands. A lot of Midlands people used to holiday down there.
If the tide was high and calm, we used to take our supper out onto the Severn bank. I had lemonade, and Dad and Mum would probably have a glass of cider. And we'd sit there until the dusk, and it was really lovely.
We sailed up with the tide to the Windbound. It was in the evening. And then we sailed back. We were lucky. It was a lovely night and sailing was good. You had the stars and the moon. The tide was being sensible. It was absolutely perfect.
Let's bask for a moment in the memories of those perfect summer days before jolting back into the harsher realities of life in the lower Severn Vale. The isolation, the constant battle with nature, and the hardship of making a living.
Between Aust and Berkeley, dozens of families were involved in the business of catching and selling salmon. It was a tough life, hard labour in all weathers, but remembered fondly by those involved. During the winter months, they cut withies and wove funnel-shaped baskets called putchers and kipes. On April the 16th, these were strung out into the estuary and checked after every tide, day or night. The traditions and skills were passed down from one generation to the next, as you'll hear from Mike Bennett, Alan Knapp, Don Riddle, Christabel Timcoe and Derek Hubie.
My grandfather's father started fishing at Berkeley, where Berkeley Power Station is, in 1907. Put in, I think it was about 300 putchers there, plus 4 kipes and forriers, which was the things to catch the eels and shrimps and that. He used to go and cut the withy around Shipperdine and out around Berkeley and all that. Make the putchers and forriers, yeah. Then he handed it down to his son, my grandfather, because my grandpa used to make putchers for over Severn as well, for over in Wales. Used to make about 200 for them. My granny used to boil the shrimps. Dad used to go around and my auntie on their bikes delivering to the different people. You know, they'd have a few shrimps over a weekend, and all the salmon used to go into Keedwells, I think their name was, in Bristol.
We used to make the kipes and all the baskets inland during the winter and then take them down to the river and put them in, but we used to take them down on a sledge, big sledge, which we pushed down on the mud, and then the horse would pull it down to the fishery. But we had to be careful out there because there was a lot of quicksand, so one day especially, I can remember because I was out there, I was only a young lad, but they used to put me on the horse when I was about 10 years old. The horse was just stood there, you know what they are, just stand there, and it was going down and down, and we had one heck of a job to get him out of it before the tide come back in, because you're only allowed so long out there, you see, to be able to put it in. At any rate, they did get him out eventually, but it was a bit frightening.
The biggest fish we caught was 36.5 pounds. It was on a very low tide on a Sunday morning, and it was my turn to inspect the fishing, and I could see this water flying up out of the basket, and I thought, on a low tide, can I chance it to go across the gully to get that fish or not? And I thought, that's a good fish, so I better chance it. So I walked across there to get this fish, and I didn't have time to kill it. So I just got my pocket knife out and cut the cords and carried the live fish back in the basket. I hooked it onto a walking stick, and my little daughter's holding it up, and the fish is bigger than her.
1984 was our last year of fishing when we did it ourselves. We had an absolutely terrible year, and we were as poor as church mice. It was terrible. Come the next year, we couldn't afford to do it again because the putters were getting old and dilapidated. We couldn't afford to take the time off in the winter to do all the cutting. And also it was expensive, the licence would have been expensive. We didn't sort of think, oh, we're never going to do this again. We just thought, look, we can't do it this year. We just can't. See what next year brings. But in fact, we never did it again.
There was a few bad years, very bad years, of salmon in the Wye, which was a big fly fishing river, one of the best in the country at one time. And there was a big deterioration in that. And the Environmental Agency blamed the poachers for catching the Wye salmon. So they wanted to get rid of the poachers. So they started rationing the catch. You were told you could catch so many. After that number, take them out next day. This really upset the people. Couldn't afford to do this. This has been going on for generations, for hundreds of years, this way of catching salmon and that. It's just finished all these fisheries.
The fisheries petered out by the end of the 1990s. As Derek says, hundreds of years of tradition disappearing in a couple of decades. This has been a common theme in our conversations with people in the lower Severn Vale. During the 20th century, they witnessed many changes to a traditional way of life that had remained largely unaltered for generations. Some changes were gradual and welcomed, such as the arrival of electricity and mains water. Others were violent and imposed, such as the Bristol Blitz during the Second World War.
Several of the people we recorded witnessed the bombing. Others were evacuated and some took in evacuees. Roger and Hazel Staley recall families carrying just a handful of possessions walking out of Bristol, hoping to find somewhere safe to stay. You'll also hear from David England, John Orway and Pat Edwards about wartime hardships and their ways of supplementing the rations.
Your mother did cook for a lot of people because you had a house full of people, and we did. Just literally walked down the lanes looking for accommodation, and they brought fleas with them. We had to ask them to leave.
We had a big house, so we had rooms. So my mother was very good at organising rooms for them. We had an attic, so we had a family up in the attic. And other rooms we could put them in. So we had quite a little house full of people, didn't we, in the war? Well, we were fortunate being farmers. We had hens, we had eggs to eat, and we had cows, so we always had plenty of milk. So on the whole, we were well off as farmers.
My grandfather had the farm down near to Pilhead, at the army camp there, of course. And during the war, they used to give us a little bit of food to eat. We had no food, you see. we as kids would go over there and scrounge a bit of food because it's rationed, so nothing to eat. We used to kill a rabbit or two, and I've even met blackbirds. Kill a blackbird and shoot a blackbird in the day, wrap it in bacon, and bake in the oven at night, and have it for supper.
In Tockington, there was a little shop at one time, and I was given a zipped-up bag on the handlebars of my bike. Now, you go up to Mrs. With this, and don't look inside. So, okay. It was quite heavy going up, and Mrs. would bring it back, and don't look inside, but it was quite light. But after a few journeys, I thought, well, I've got to find out. And in there was some bacon and eggs going up, and then coming back there were cigarettes, because my father smoked like a trooper. And I obviously looked guilty, because I got really told off for looking in the bag, which I denied, but they wouldn't believe me.
When I first started at the shop, bearing in mind I'm sort of 15, going on 16, bacon was boned out in an outer room. A side of bacon would be put on a slab and then it would be boned and the maggots removed and disposed of. Then it would be brought in once it had been doctored and sliced on an Avery slice machine.
The war also changed the population of the lower Severn Vale and brought an influx of new people to the area: Polish refugees, prisoners of war, service personnel, and American GIs. Here are the recollections of Eric Garrett, Marjorie Wallaker, and Ron Taylor.
The Americans were stationed at Overcourt. When they heard of the drink cider, they wanted to know what cider and that was. They would come to the White Hart at Overston to try cider in their jeeps. So you can imagine Saturday nights with Americans and others. A local three-piece band started up. Well, we had no music license, so my mother was always concerned. And she said, well, you can carry on as long as the policeman takes a blind eye to what is going on. And of course, the policeman did take. But the sing-songs that used to take place in the pub on a Saturday night was unbelievable.
The portway from Hot Wells to the docks was full of soldiers, and at night they would kick down on the grass on their way through to the docks to go abroad. And we opened up our hall for a hot cup of tea. Well, that's all there was, just a hot cup of tea, and to get warm. And we had a big tortoise heater, and they used to come in to have a warm. They were only 18-year-olds, but parents, like my parents, were frightened to death. My father used to come and fetch me every night.
The first regiment that was billeted in Thornbury, I think they were called the 52nds. A couple of them lodged at our house. They were spending the day or the afternoon down at Bert Pierce's at the bathings. That was a concreted pool, and that consisted of the stream coming in one end and going out the other. And there was a hut there which you changed. We spent hours and hours in Thornbury bathings. You know, everybody learnt to swim down the bathings. The soldiers were wearing the trilby hats, and the civilians were all wearing army caps, so it must have been quite an afternoon. I think they were enjoying themselves, because I think most of those fellows went off to France.
And sadly, some of the young men in Ron's photo never returned.
The war changed many things, but a major one that affected rural communities in the lower Severn Vale was mechanisation. In the first decades of the 20th century, almost everything was done by hand or horse. This was predominantly a farming area. Boys left school at 14 to start work on the land. People moved about the countryside either by foot or by horse and cart. Eric Garrett and Ron Taylor remember the enormous timber wagons, and Don Riddle recalls his grandfather's horse-drawn cider press, lugged from village to village.
We always had a lot of timber wagons around, and I can always remember the scenes, 8 cart horses pulling timber along. So you would have 4 pairs of horses pulling a wagon. The small rise in Overston by the church there, I can always remember seeing these horses with sparks coming off their shoes, pulling up with the whipper up, getting all these horses pulling together. Major scene that was. See timber like that being pulled around.
My dad's 3 horses was Captain, Prince and Bob. Big shire horses. It'll never be seen again now because he used to go through Thornbury with the other fellow, with Charlie Stay, after they'd been out all day, and they'd come back with a extended wagon with the timber on they'd been out and collected. It was a sight magnificent coming up through Thornbury, and when they got up to the crossroads where it's in Thornbury now, at the top of Gloucester Road, what is now the Undertaker's was trained as the butcher. The leading horse used to walk right up by Traern's window on the opposite side of the road before he'd start to turn. Everybody thought he was going straight through the window, and then he'd turn as he got to that window so as to bring the wagon round. Marvellous, really.
My grandfather, he assisted with the portable cider mill, which used to travel around all the parish and make the cider in the autumn, and then the cider cells were in the spring. The portable mill used to be hauled round farm to farm because there was a vast acreage of orchard in Aubrey-on-Severn in those days. This mobile unit was on 4 wheels. It had 2 stone crushers in the bottom, and they shoved the apples into the top, and as they revolved, that crushed apple and went into a trough in the bottom. And then it was shoveled out with a wooden shovel and put into cloths in a press to squeeze the juice out.
These were the days when wassailing was commonplace, and the lower Severn Vale was awash with orchards. Farm labourers were paid in cider, and people knew the different apple varieties and what they were used for. Here are the memories of Kath Orway, Christabel Timcoe, Mike Bennett and Sandra Gray.
The season started August time with an apple called a tompat. I always remember the tompat. It was a very red apple and finished with perhaps a Newton Wonder or Bramley's. Often got sent up a tree with one thin branch on and about 2 apples to pick. My father stored them outside. Everything had to be stored outside in the fruit line. And when it was winter time and he wanted to move them, he very carefully picked them up. Mother'd have to light the fire in the sitting room to warm the room up to thaw the apples out. So he'd bring them very gingerly into the house and put them all around the fire.
They used to pick crates and crates of apples which were sold up at market. And Mum used to hawk the apples around. She could sell anything because she was brought up in a shop. Cider apples come in later, really, in mid-September. And Dad used to employ a couple of aunts and any local women that were short of a bob or 2 and pick up apples and sell them to the cider companies. But I remember distinctly back in the early 60s that he got very cross one year because the price they were given for the apples was terrible. It wasn't worth him paying the ladies to pick them up. So he went and bought a cider press and he started making his own cider.
The Bennetts was always known for drinking their cider because we always made cider. We had our own press and that, yeah. We make about 500-600 gallons ourselves, sometimes it'd be 1,000. It's the proper cider, nothing put in it. It was a proper juice, you know. When Grab was doing it, that was their wages for helping him put the fishing in and things like that. As long as we got a gallon of cider, we'd be all right. That's all we want.
A lot of people used to come here because we had a mill here and different farmers would come with their trailer and with their apples on and their barrel, and they would sort of October to Christmas time, they would be making all this cider. If you had farm workers, they used to get a sort of cider allowance. And people did used to come, and buy the cider, the farmhouse cider. But we had a couple of break-ins. Then they brought in VAT on cider and customs and excise. So it sort of come to a natural end, really.
The orchards started to decline in the war years when farmers were encouraged to plough up as much land as possible. Tractors replaced horses and combine harvesters replaced the old threshing machines. Modern milking parlours were installed. The churn was replaced by the milk tanker. Smaller farms disappeared, larger ones embraced technology and thrived. Let's hear some reflections on this from Don Riddle, Richard Bennett, Mike Bennett and Dave Staley.
Just in Aubrey itself, we had up to 30 milk producers. Now in the parish of Aubrey-on-Severn now there is 3 or 4 milk producers at the most. Cattle have seemed to have just disappeared off the face of the earth.
When I came into the farm, we had about 40 cows, milking cows, all tied up in the cow sheds, the old-fashioned cow sheds. When I started to work with my father, we then put in a new milking parlour and built a bigger cattle shed, so the cows went from 40 to 80. Over the years, we increased the numbers, we increased the size of the buildings, bought more land. My son took over, built the herd up again, and we got up to 500 cows, milking cows. Technology on a farm now is, you wouldn't have even dreamt of it back 20 years ago even. Everything's being recorded now. You can go in on the computer and know exactly what each cow's been given that day or all that week, even for the year. Its technology has changed tremendously, and I think that's changed farming as well.
I don't enjoy it so much now as I did then. It's all mechanised, jobs. Tractor driving is not my thing really. I'd sooner be working with the stock. My way of looking at it, there's no future in it. If I was going to start out now, I wouldn't go into farming. It's too much paperwork for one thing, because you can't do nothing now without licensing this or where everything's moving to it, which is perhaps a good thing in a way since foot and mouth, but it's too much of it, Whereas years ago you used to go buy something and bring it home, and when you want to sell it, you sold it, sort of thing.
Once you're a farmer, it's in your blood. You can't help it. You're always looking at the crops. You're always watching the weather. You always long for spring to see things burst into life. You enjoy the seasons. You're kind of always conscious and aware of what's going on in your surroundings all the time. We enjoy, watching the grass grow, seeing the seasons come and go. Who knows in the future what might happen? There might be some crop that has medicinal purposes that may be suitable to grow in this area. There might be some biofuel in the future. We just don't know what's going to happen. But land is an asset, and I just see myself as kind of like a steward of it. So I want to try and look after it as best I can, and then hand it on to the next generation. And then it's for them to decide what they want to do with it.
Whatever your views on the future of farming, there's universal agreement that at times it's a hard life, especially in the depth of winter. 2 particular years conjured up the most memories here: the winter of 1947 and that of 1962 to 63, when the snow fell on Boxing Day and stayed till April. Among the memories we recorded were those of Sandra Gray and Richard Bennett.
We went down to Warning Farm down at Pilning, and we were there in the winter of 63. You just couldn't get out, and the rains we didn't know where the road was. We were just snowed in. My mother and father were sort of struggling, trying to unfreeze everything and milk the cows. And of course, in those days, the tractors were little ones. It's not like the big machinery you've got nowadays. My father had to take the milk in churns, which is what it was then, just up to the next farm. But, it was all a big task to get through the snow.
I can remember 63 as though it happened yesterday. My turn to do the milking that next morning, and when I looked out the window there must have been a good foot of snow. The cows in those days were still out, and I remember going up over the hill behind the farm to find the cows and walking through snowdrifts up to your waist, and all the cows were underneath the rookery I was talking about. And to try and get them away from there to come down for milking was difficult. I can remember falling over in the snow and got the cows in, managed to get them tied up, but we couldn't find the milk churns. They were all covered in snow. Eventually we got the milking done, and then the milk lorry couldn't get out, so we had to take it by tractor then into Thornbury. They were tough times.
That winter it was so cold. You can't imagine now how cold it was. You know, everywhere was cold. The water tank in the attic froze. In fact, the flannels in the bathroom froze to the sink. I don't think I've ever been as cold since, really. We had a pig for a wedding present. She farrowed, I think it was the end of January, and it was freezing cold out there. And she had about 12 beautiful pigs, and she couldn't give any milk. Her milk wouldn't come down at all. And so, we spent 3 nights I spent in here with piglets in my arms, my coat around them, trying to keep them alive, and boiling up milk and salts and things to try and feed them. And everyone died.
During this appalling winter, work on the construction of the Severn Bridge, which had started 2 years earlier, virtually ground to a halt. The machinery literally froze, as we'll hear from engineer John Evans. He got involved in the bridge construction completely by chance after spotting a small sign on a visit home.
I was travelling back to South Wales, and I crossed on the ferry, and I saw a sign saying Severn Bridge construction. There was very little going on the site at the time. Anyway, I knocked on the door of what was obviously the contractor's site office and asked to see the agent. I said, got a job for me. And he basically said, well, that pile of applications over there are for site engineers. And I said, fine, but here I am. He said, when can you start? And I said, well, if you push me, I can start on Monday. Through that very, very cold spell in early '63, the quarries up in the Vale froze up. It was so cold that the crusher jaws were shattering in the cold. And so one by one the quarries weren't able to supply us. Meanwhile, down at the Beachley end, there was several feet of snow. The road down from Beachley past Sedbury, there was a snowdrift there. It filled a little valley, and there were a couple of houses in the bottom. They're still there now. And the snow was right up to the eaves of the houses. And the people had to dig their way out. So anyway, we managed to keep going because we were all prepared for it. But the quarries ran out, various other things ran out, and eventually things like the river even started having ice floes on it. The cold lasted right through to March.
This period for many of the inhabitants of the lower Severn Vale was one of unprecedented development. Electricity and mains water arrived in the area, construction was going on all around them, and new people moved in. Bill Gill was one of them. He came here in 1960 as part of the team commissioning Berkeley Power Station.
I was in charge during the commissioning of one team. There were 5 teams loading uranium into the reactor, the first reactor. The leader would go in first to make sure everything was all right inside the reactor before the team came in. So you were first in and then you were last out. You'd check, make sure everything was all right for the next team in. I remember on a couple of these occasions, I'd been there in the reactor all on my own, and I'd think about this uranium, these metal bars, and think back to the coal station where you could see coal burning, you'd look through darkened glasses into the boiler and it's almost white heat. But here you were loading bars of metal. If you could pick those bars out later on, you couldn't, because of course then they were very active. It looked exactly the same. You wouldn't know anything had happened to it. And that was sort of my first experience of thinking, this is a bit of magic. Despite all the nuclear physics he'd done, this is magic, you know.
After a stint at Berkeley, Bill moved on to work at Oldbury Power Station. Dave Trivett was also employed at Oldbury, but in a rather different capacity. You'll also hear from Christabel Timcoe, Joyce Tibbenham and Marion Hubie.
The whole power station took about 7 years, I believe. I was only there for about 9 months. They'd been there for over a year, excavating in the river to create a reservoir. So when the tide came in, it'd fill the reservoir up. And when the tide went out, they'd have enough water there for the cooling of the power station. And is what would happen, the hot water would be then ejected back through pipes into the main flow of the river.
Fish are not daft. They're a bit like humans. They like a bit of warmth, you know, a bit of central heating. So we used to have scientists come from Bath University checking the number of fish that were starting to appear outside the power station. And then we used to have a bird society come to the power station. Wagtails used to roost in the turbine hall roof because the heat would rise up, reach the roof and go out through roof vents. And where these roof vents were, many wagtails roosted. And the Bird Society used to say it was one of the biggest wagtail colonies in the country. We had open days in the early days. I remember one day on one Sunday we had 10,000 visitors on one day. They used to use it as a backcloth for a lot of series on TV. Doctor Who, the users. Blake 7, don't you remember that? They had the British Monopoly Championships on top of the reactors. I think on the whole, people quite liked it.
There wasn't any opposition, really. The opposition consisted of the fishermen, Dad and Vic and the Cornocks, who suffered dreadfully because it was their fishing that was compulsory purchase, one of the best fishings on the river that had been in the Cornocks family for donkey's years. And it was nearly the end of Tommy Cornock. He was a great friend of my dad's. It was terrible to see, really. Terrible what the effect. Of course, they lived right next to it and their farm was in the shadow of it. So it was a huge change.
To be quite honest, it was very good for the village because they were very generous. They wanted to keep on the right side of the village, but they did give a lot of money. Of course, it took a lot of the land, but I think all in all, it was really good because the employment. My father worked there when it was built, and he said that was the happiest days of his life because it was easier work than he'd done before. My son worked there. My daughter-in-law was a guide there. So it's given a lot of people a lot of employment.
Our dining room for the VIPs was built on the second story and it looked right over the river. It was a lovely spot. You could see over to the other side and see the boats going down. There was a lot that went regularly. They knew all the people that worked there, especially the ladies in the canteen, and as they went by they always blew their little tooters.
Whilst Berkeley and Oldbury power stations were providing employment in the north, Avonmouth was booming in the south. The proliferation of factories, depots and businesses around the docks meant that you could walk out of a job on Friday and start another on Monday. Here are the memories of Leon Franklin, Ken Jewell, Richard Chilcott and Mike Pemberton.
Most docks, when they unload a ship,
The goods that come off the ship go into the warehouse on the dockside. Avonmouth, quite unique, that they unload the ship straight to the lorry, and the lorry takes it out the docks. And Avonmouth is quite unique in that. This company, Western Transport, that I worked for, they had a very large depot in Avonmouth, so we could unload stuff from the docks and bring it out to our compound and store it and deliver as per instructions from the customer. But it guaranteed you work. Everything used to come into Avonmouth in those days. Tea, aluminium, copper. We used to get refrigerated ships coming to Avonmouth docks from New Zealand, full of lambs and cheese and butter, and we used to run that to the coal stores in Avonmouth. Oh yeah, everything and anything in those days.
The docks industry was predominantly a manual working job. Containerisation hadn't really started then. Everything was manhandled off, you know. I can remember bunches of bananas being carried to the shed. My first job was a crew member on the tug. My first day, I can remember being approached by an engineer. His first words to me were, "You don't want to work here, mate. You don't want to work here." I said, "Well, how long have you been here?" He said, "I've been here for 30 years. I said, "Well, it can't be that bad then, can it?" And we went out and brought a banana boat in. It's an unusual job. You see tugboatmen, and they're a different band of people because they don't work 9 to 5. They follow the moon in the sun because they follow the tides around wherever they are. And it's more of a hobby than a job.
I started as a messenger boy. It's meant to be 2 years. When you're 18, you went on to the man's wage and onto the man's job, shall we say. 6 months down the line of being a messenger boy, I was told I had to go into the granary booking office, which was only meant to be temporary. I ended up staying there for about 3 years before I went into the granary. Sometimes it could be dusty, sometimes it could be itchy. If you had barley coming in, that was always an itchy thing. And you get dust payments. You used to get 2 half days usually. So if you went past 12 o'clock, you get a whole day's pay. So we had used to leave the machinery running, so the boss, he noticed running, but he wouldn't know what was on the belt. If the belt was empty or full, he wouldn't know, unless he come up. And if he did come up, we'd just finished, and we were turning it all off.
A lot of the neighbours worked on the docks. My father worked for a company called BOCM. They transported animal feed. He used to leave home at 3 o'clock in the morning to drive his wagon to Gloucester with the animal feed on it. In the school holidays, when we had our summer holidays, he used to pick me up on his second trip and take me to Gloucester with him, high up in this big lorry. You didn't talk to each other because the engine was so noisy, you wouldn't be able to hear each other anyway. It had wooden floors, so you could actually see the road through the floor of the lorry.
One of the biggest employers at Avonmouth was the smelting works, originally developed in World War I to make mustard gas. By the 1950s, it was known as the Britannia Smelting Works. For Alan McCarthy, a young and ambitious chemist, it was the place to work. You'll also hear from Chris Mabey and Richard Chilcott.
Before I went to the smelting works, my father was dead against me going to the smelting works. He said, "That's an awful place down there. Have you seen all the dust and the fumes and what have you?" And tried to dissuade me, but I wanted to be a chemist. And this was the best place to go to be a chemist. No question about that. Obviously, there was a lot of pollution there. One of the major areas where there were gases getting out was what was called the sinter plant. There was always a smell of sulphur dioxide around there. And later in my career at the smelting works, we regularly walked past the sintering plant on our way back to the laboratory. And I developed a reaction to sulphur dioxide, and it made me sneeze. And I would sneeze and sneeze. The record was about half an hour. My ears itched, my eyes watered, my throat went, and my voice went deeper and deeper, and I just coughed and spluttered.
The only accident I had when I was working was the first week I was in the smelting works. I had to go into this reactor and take the top off it, and it was blocked, and I got gas with HF acid, which put me in safe made for a week.
I was there 15 years in total. I had 10 years on the refinery. Being on the refinery, you had more chance of getting lead in your blood. But I got leaded twice. It was only because of the particular job I was doing, mind you. It was called a blue powder plan. A blue powder is basically lead dust. To keep it down, it used to be washed down with water so it would become a slurry. And you'd have to clean the pump out every day religiously. So I used to get covered in blue powder, and it's finer than talcum powder. It'd go through your pores. And it was a horrible job in the end, so I got leaded twice. And then they sent me back to the refinery where I stayed.
They certainly had a problem with lead. One place I worked was called the Sample House, and there they took samples from various parts of the plant, various materials that were being used, and that was sent off to the works laboratories for analysis for all sorts of things, but often lead, cadmium, what have you. They had got to a stage, I was told a few years earlier, where they realised they were measuring their blood lead content, and this had got unacceptable levels, and they put in a lot of effort to put dust extraction equipment on all the crushing machines they had there, and that had brought things under control. People said the actual illness level of people on the plant was less than the population as a whole. Now, I've no evidence why they said that, but that was what we were told.
There were undoubtedly health risks and pollution, but it's easy to forget that there was also groundbreaking science going on in Avonmouth's chemical factories, which ultimately led to safer environments and lower emissions. Paul Baumann is a witness to the changes. He's been birdwatching in this area for 50 years.
To school when I started coming down here, I was about 14 when I first walked down from Bristol and Hembury. A good hour's walk, 30 old industrial units and the soot and smog of Phil Black's, the old factory that used to be there, and couldn't wait until I passed my driving test and got a car, and I've been coming down in the car ever since. There's certainly no heavy industry now, industrial units, chemical works in the Avonmouth area anymore, but back in the 70s there were all sorts of factories belching out chemicals into ditches and smoke, and certainly wasn't a pleasant place to be. Time moves on and these heavy chemical plants are shutting all over the place, and luckily the placement units of the warehouses and distribution parks are providing lots of jobs and less chemical hazards down there. People come down for the weekend, the first thing they do is they come out to the seawall and they look down towards Avonmouth and they go, oh, look at all that pollution, but there isn't anymore. There's wind turbines, there's a dock, gas power station chucking out steam. There are no nasty chemicals anymore being chucked out into the ditches and the streams along the roadside anymore. It is a far less polluted place than it was now.
As well as telling us about the changes to the industrial landscape and their workplaces, people have also described how their communities changed, sometimes almost beyond recognition. Sharhampton and Avonmouth were bustling villages of houses interspersed with small independent shops. Here are the recollections of John Hutton, Leon Franklin, Patricia Peters, Mike Pemberton and Mary Ace.
There was an unwritten law then, we're talking 50s. If you had anything painted, windows, doors and everything else, you were required to paint it every 5 years. So I was up painting the front bedroom window. Oh, John! It was Jack next door. What are you doing? I'm painting the window, Jarrett. Waste of time, innit? Why is it a waste of time? Well, he said they're going to knock it down. Who's going to knock my house down? Well, he said, corporation. Have you been down to the planning office lately? They said they want to widen the road. What do they want to widen the road for? Well, he said, this is the 50s now. With all this traffic coming up from Avonmouth, all these flower lorries and heavy traffic, accident waiting to happen, and they don't want it to.
When I was young, there was a rank of Georgian houses there, which I can just about remember. But they demolished those. I mean, they wouldn't be allowed to do it now, but they demolished those. And they built like a new rank of shops. Walking through Shire, there were grocers, greengrocers. We had a couple of hardware shops, 3 or 4 banks. At one stage, there was a jeweller's shop. Another stage, had an arcade there. And then right at the end of the high street, we had a co-op. There was a fishmonger, big fish and chip shop. Cockle lady used to come up from South Wales every Saturday. And she used to sit in the corner there all day on a Saturday selling cockles. By the pint, by the half pint, by the quarter pint.
She used to come around the streets with her basket. I know my grandma used to come and visit me on a Friday. And she used to go out with her jug, have a half pint of cockles off the lady, and then when she got older and couldn't walk round the village, she used to sit down by Jeff Hawkins' shop, there on the corner.
There was not this sense of urgency, everything was much slower. There weren't supermarkets, there were small shops. You go in for your groceries and you knew the person behind the counter and have a little chat. My mother used to buy her groceries from a little shop in the high street called Salmon and Hutchins, and they only had 2 branches. They also had a branch in Avonmouth, but they used to have this carbon copy book, and if you wrote down your shopping list every week and took it in, they would deliver it on a Friday. So it's a bit like internet shopping now.
You used to know everybody, or people down the street, everybody, but it's completely changed. It was going to be quite a high-class place down here, originally, because behind this row of houses here, there used to be tennis courts. Then they were pulled down, and then they had the Congregational Church there. It was a lovely church. That's gone. There's houses there. We had the Catholic Church at the top of the road, now flats. It's completely altered. Nearly every lovely building they've taken away. Such a shame. It's really, really changed.
As Mary suggests, much of Avonmouth was demolished and rebuilt, the community bisected by the M5 bridge. The old Sharhampton to Pill ferry became redundant. In its heyday, it had been a busy commuter service across the Avon, remembered fondly by Leon Franklin and Lofty Daniels.
Whereas now, Station Road is very much a dead end. In those days, it was a thoroughfare because of the ferry. You have people going to and from work. You know, Sharhampton people going to work at Ham Green Hospital and Porter's Head Power Station, and Pill people coming to work in Avonmouth at the docks and what have you. It's a very busy road in those days. People up and down all the time. My dad used to charge a couple of pence a week to park the bike in the yard. There was a lot of intermarriage between Sharhampton and Pill people over the years, because people from Pill would come to Sharhampton to go to the cinema. Obviously, people from Shire would go across to Pill to go to the hospital to visit people and just go over for the afternoon.
The opening hours were for the pubs were half an hour extra in Pill, so it was a bit of a magnet for people this side. Plus they had musical licences over there with jukeboxes and all that, which they didn't have this side. Another added bonus. As long as somebody was waiting, they go backwards and forwards for you. Sometimes you miss it, all depends what time you got chucked at the pub, and you had a 10-mile walk, 5 miles up and 5 miles back, which was a very long way when you could see your house was 100 yards away.
Further up the coast, ferries across the Severn have been plying their trade to Wales since Roman times. The car ferry at Aust finally closed when the Severn Bridge opened. We recorded many memories of this ferry. Here are just a few of them from Kath and John Allway and John Evans.
Sunday school outings. First of all, we went to Severn Beach in a horse and cart, and then we went to Chepstow. And we thought that was fantastic. We used to cross the ferry and then walk from Beachley to Chepstow and then walk back. And one time we got on the ferry, went to come across, and there was a bullfight above us, a German plane and an English plane having a bullfight. So the ferryman stuck us down in the bottom of the ferry. If they'd sunk the ferry, I wouldn't be here now. When we got to this side, we were told to run, and we had to run up the pier. The bullfight continued. They were looking for the Severn Tunnel, to bomb the Severn Tunnel.
The Aust Ferry I knew well because until I was 4 I walked in calipers because of rickets. Now rickets is supposed to be lack of milk. Now I lived on a farm and drank gallons of it, so I don't know why. But the specialist who was treating me said to my grandmother who was paying, take him down on the ferry every day and stand with his legs apart and rock with the boat. When he comes off, catch some of that juicy seaweed and rub into his legs. It's the iodine in there. So Gran didn't take me, but my mother did. And bearing in mind she was walking with a stick, she must have really loved me on a blustery, windy day, rocking boat to go down there every day except Christmas Day.
In an Austin 7 it was quite exciting because particularly if the tide was ebbing, the slipways would be quite damp. And you drove on from the side onto a turntable, and the men would beckon you forward. And as you were moving forward, they used to pull the turntable round, so your back wheels shot round out of your control, and you were propelled into a slot on the deck of the ferry. When you came off then, it was partly the same manoeuvre, but you then drove onto a wet and slippery slipway. There are a number of instances where vehicles either went straight over the other side of the slip or slid around a bit and didn't get up the slope and had to be pushed. So it was quite exciting.
The Severn Bridge opened in September 1966, but within 20 years it was obvious that the increase and weight of traffic was greater than anyone expected. In the mid-80s it was strengthened, and a few years later work began on the second Severn crossing. Here are the reflections of Eric Garrett, John Evans, John and Kath Orway and Andrew Hewitt.
A Severn Bridge had been talked about for over 100 years. I've got some of the sketches of the types of bridge that was planned back in the 1840s. There was no complaints because everybody knew that sometime or another a bridge was going to come. So everybody kept saying when, you know.
Before we started the original construction, you had a ferry, or ferry service rather, that at the best could take 500 vehicles if all three ferries were operating in one tide period. And now that number of vehicles probably crosses in 7 or 8 minutes. The importance of these two structures in the project area cannot be underestimated.
I cannot remember where we went, but a group of us from the village went to meet the highway authorities, I presume, and he had a map with a blue line on it, which is where the motorway is now. But we got quite stroppy with him and demanded it came through Alst. So as Mr. Jones in the shop could sell his petrol and his sweets and his cheese and all that. The chap must have thought I've come to the lunatic asylum tonight because we got really stroppy with him. But we didn't know what a motorway was. It was just a blue line on the map. Thank goodness it didn't come through Alst.
We had a car park down on the wharf. We used to run a car park for people to park so that they could go and have a look at the bridge. And we did that for about 4 years. The next door had a caravan site with workers that lived up there. You used to hear the things going up and down when they put the wires to the bridge to keep it up. Clonk, clonk all day and all night. Never stopped. But we got used to it.
One of the most peaceful places to be, the place where you'd like to take a deck chair and spend an afternoon on a sort of nice warm day like today, is if you go down the towers and onto the top of the pier, because there's a vast concrete pier that supports the towers. It's very peaceful down there because the deck is above your head, the traffic's above that, so you can hardly hear the traffic. You're out there in the middle of the estuary surrounded by water. It's very like being on a boat. Within the anchorage, and you can actually sort of get through a trapdoor and climb down a ladder, there's a vast chamber, and it's almost cathedral-like down there. You go down about 60 feet, I suppose. What happens is that the actual suspension cable is made up of thousands of individual thin wires, each about the thickness of a pencil. Those wires all splay out inside this great chamber. There's all these individual wires splaying out. It's just an amazing place.
The last voice you heard there was Andrew Hewitt, the engineer responsible for the bridge strengthening. Andrew was later involved in planning the approach roads to the second Severn crossing, which cut through several communities. You'll also hear from hydrographic surveyor Richard Chilcott and machine operator Dave Trivett.
It was very different for me because on the old Severn Bridge I was looking out for traffic, but there was a very distinct change when I became involved in planning the approach roads, where a lot of the work that we had to do was face to face with people, hear their stories about the effect that this was going to have on them or their community, see what we could do which might be different, which might help, but knowing that in the end something was going to happen and we are going to have to provide a road of some sort.
We were out surveying one morning. This particular morning was a waste of time. You couldn't do nothing. Not only was the boot rocking and rolling, it was churning up all the mud, so you couldn't get a reading. It's like driving in the fog, like, you know. And then we had a call to, can you take an early lunch because you got to meet some people from the Ministry of Transport coming on the boat. We got to go down by the old Severn Bridge down through the chutes. So as we were going down, one of the chaps was a nice enough guy. He was quite pleasant chatting and that. And I said, oh, why are we going down there? Can you tell me? Are you allowed to tell me? And he said, yeah, they're on about building a second crossing.
I was on what was known as a rubber duck, which basically is a 360-degree excavator mounted on a chassis which has drive wheels on it as opposed to tracks. And I was sent out with one of the section foremen on the second Severn crossing. I was working away and all of a sudden I blew my horn at him. Come on, it's time to go. So he looked at his watch. He said, oh, tide didn't due in for another hour and a half yet. I said, we're on a force 9 gale out here and it's rising. And you see that pond over there? Yeah, he said. I said, it wasn't there 10 minutes ago. I said, the tide's turned and it's on its way in. No, he said, it's not due. I said, don't care what is due. The actual wind is driving in faster. I said, so up to you, I'm going in. You can stay here if you like. So I turned the machine around and I started driving away from him. All of a sudden I heard him screaming. He was up to his knees in water. So I reversed back up so he could get on and we came back in. He hadn't realised just how fast that water could come in.
The strength and dangers of the tide, a common and recurring theme amongst the people we've recorded.
Everyone who lives near the Severn respects it. Despite the drainage systems and sea defences put in place to protect the floodplain, the area still floods regularly and with devastating consequences. The personal accounts we've collected of flooding span the lower Severn Vale, from Shepherdine to Sharhampton. Here are a few of them, from Don Riddle, Richard Bennett, Lynn Carnaby and Matthew Riddle.
We had quite a big bad flood year in July 57, I believe it was. And then we had another big flood when the river pushed its banks at Littleton-on-Severn and it flowed right through here. The sheep was all drowned and there was a car parked outside there and you could see inch and a half of the windscreen. There was an Austin 10 floated down the road and lodged on the post with his wheels that far off the road. The anchor in was right up to the bar.
1968, the worst floods I can remember in my lifetime. That bridge was washed away by my brothers. If you went back through there a month later, there were bales of hay up in the branches of trees. Oldbury-on-Severn and all the way through Shepherdine and so on were all underwater in July for months, and you could smell it even.
We did have this terrible flood where the river came over and it came right up to the end of brick cottages down at the end of the village there, And the people in the village, heaven knows where they found a boat, but anyway, they took the boat down to Jeannie and Rodney's house, and Karen and Susan were only 2 and 1, they were tiny little babies, and the water was coming up to the second floor. Ooh. And it was midnight, and so they were floating around their orchard and said, "Would you like to take the children?" Jeannie said to me, "I was never going to drop the children out of the window in the dark." She said to them, "No, you can come back in the morning when it's light." She said, "I'm not dropping them out of the window now." The water took until the following June, so it would have been in the winter. It took 6 months for all the water to drain through the sluices to go back into the river. And that's when the Water Board obviously decided to raise the bank and reorganise it.
The seawalls actually are the responsibility of the Environment Agency for maintaining them, for repairing them if they sink a bit. There was a bad flood in 1981. A breach occurred at Cow Hill. The tide, because of low pressure, was even higher than it would have been, and it actually broke through down at Littleton and raced across the farmland there to Albury village. I know my uncle's farm was flooded. He was actually up to his waist in water, trying to get cattle out of his sheds onto higher ground. I think he got all the cattle out, but sadly he lost all his sheep. It then raced up towards the village, and people who were drinking at the Anchor couldn't get out, so they were there all night. But that was a tidal breach. That was a tide coming over. And after that, the Environment Agency then spent a lot of money raising the banks between Ost and Sharpness to a higher standard, and actually in some places moving them.
It's nothing new for the people of the lower Severn Vale to continually shape and reshape their landscape. They've been doing it for hundreds of years, just as they've been passing down traditions and stories to each following generation.
This is a land dotted with churches and chapels, and many of the people we recorded told us of their lifelong connections with these institutions. Roger Staley, who you'll hear shortly, referred to them as the marriage bureaus of his day. You'll also hear from Pat Edwards and Alfred Till and Sandra Gray.
We met through the church. I ran a youth fellowship for young people from the different churches in Thornbury. United Youth Fellowship, we used to call it. I was keen to get the young people together, and so I went to see the ministers of all the different churches and asked them if I could have one of their rooms on a Sunday evening once a month. There was a lot of little chapels around in the villages and so forth, and I was quite a strong Christian at the time, or still am, I suppose. And I used to take young people in this little van I had to take the services, and so I had quite a round, probably 30 or 40 different chapels in the area.
When I was about 11, I decided that I wanted to go to Sunday school, which was at the Mission Hall, which is now the Scout Hall in Pilning. And I used to come down on a bus on a Sunday afternoon and go to Sunday school. And then I asked the vicar of the day, Reverend Thomas, if I could join the church choir. And then when I was 17 and a half or thereabouts, we had this hairy-legged chap turn up to come to play the organ. And the rest is history, because I married him.
My grandmother was religious. She used to look after the Shepherdine Church. It's a tin place. It's at the bottom of the field of chapel houses in the corner. She used to look after this church. And me and my brother on a Sunday, we had to go to church every Sunday and sit in the back seat. She used to ring the bell, and the bell was on the outside of the church. And in them days you get men walking about, looking for work. One day one man come in and he said to my gran, he says, "Mrs. Till," he says, "if you ring that bell any harder," he says, "you will knock the tabernacle down."
It's built on part of the field we rent. All I've got is the lease agreement. Now the rent is 10p on Lady Day and on Michaelmas. So it's 20p a year rent we pay for the ground that it stands in. We always have a communion, 9:30 on the fourth Sunday of every month. It holds about 30, but this Christmas we were very fortunate. A lot of families had family staying, and we had 25, which is, filled the church lovely.
Another important meeting place near the Tin Chapel was the Windbound Inn, which sadly hasn't stood the test of time. The Windbound was a favourite watering hole of boatmen plying their trade on the Severn. It was also home to Jan Small, who moved there as a teenager with her mother when her uncle Morty ran the pub. You'll also hear from Sandra Gray.
It was just a bar with a bench. The barrels were on trestles, and bottled beer and lemonade and stuff was underneath the bar, and there were small trestle seats round the room. A lot of people used to come out to walk along the bank. Perhaps encouragement came. Mother started making salmon sandwiches. We get a salmon from the local fisherman, Tommy Cornock, and he had baskets by the lights that were in the middle of the river. Morty used to cook the fish whole, gut it but keep it whole, and Mother and I used to make the flipping sandwiches. And I used to pinch a salmon and get told off.
At the end, it was a care home for adults with learning difficulties. It needed a lot of upgrading and spending money on it. I suppose they put it up for sale, and the new power station people bought it, and it was left empty, and it got vandalised, and it was boarded up. It's been going to be taken down over the last several years, but it was actually done in December last year.
We did see it at the end of last year. I didn't really look at it very much. It's longing for what has gone past. It'll never be. My husband suggested we buy a house out there or get a house. We didn't have the money for one thing, but I said no, because it's not the same. The characters have gone, things are different. It's longing for what's gone. And I'm glad I've got inside loo and running water and central heating. Yeah.
Perhaps Jan's words remind us that it's easy to look back with rose-tinted specs, but in many ways it was a hard life, and one that most wouldn't want to return to. In fact, despite increased building and industrial development, the people we recorded feel mostly optimistic and hopeful about the future. In Lawrence Weston, long-time residents Mike and Jackie Crouch and Mark Pepper have thrown themselves into projects aimed at improving the area for the next generation.
The thing I like to see kids being well looked after and their projects and what they want to do. I like to push that forward and say, look, we must encourage them. It's not my age group. We've had our time. It's the children, the younger generation. And with Jackie and I, we've got 14 grandchildren and 9
great-grandchildren. We're on the way, so that'll be 10. To me, it's always been home. It's always been home, and it'll always be my home. Bring the place back out and people will say, hang on a minute, I could live here for 20 odd years, quite happily.
The final straw came when they closed the college. But when they shut that college, that stirred up a lot of emotional ties within people. And then we came as a group together as friends of the college site. We then looked at, okay, we can't have the college. What best would suit the area? We don't know. Let's go out and survey all our other residents. So we trained up some local residents to go door knocking their fellow residents to ask them what's good about Lawrence Weston, what's not so good, what changes they would like to see, blah, blah, blah. We know what the problems are, we know where we want to get to, and more importantly, we know how to get there.
What I like about the ambition of Lawrence Weston is when it first started and we were invited to come over, the first thing we said was, if we're going to go forward as a group and do things, Please let's remember to respect each and everybody. I think we can and hopefully will achieve a lot bigger things in the future.
So what will this area be like in the future? How will people live and work in the Lower Severn Vale 50 years from now? Today's children are growing up in a world that's almost unrecognisable to their grandparents. We spoke to Rosie, Caitlin, Matthew, Theo and Lily. All are 14 and from the Thornbury area.
Littleton is a really good place to live, and it's a really great community because everyone likes to interact and there are a lot of events going on that you can go to. My gran and granddad live in Littleton. The house they live in used to be an ale house, and my gran tells me a lot about how she used to go out with her parents down to the Severn and they went fishing.
I wouldn't want to move out of Thornbury because obviously like all my mates and that are in Thornbury, so we normally just go up the high street, but then there's like a lot of places where you can go up, like Mondays, there's like fields behind that, like public fields and that where you can go. So there's like a lot of places to go and there's like loads of places to walk your dog and stuff like that.
They've recently built loads of houses, so all the people from the city have started to come down here. I'm not really that happy because they've got rid of all the fields where all the sheep and animals were, and they've built loads of houses on them.
I think that my most visited place for Thornbury for recreation is the bus stop. To be frank, it's a good portal to the rest of the west. If I want to go somewhere with friends, I will most likely go out of Thornbury.
I'm not really Thornbury that much because it's a bit boring. I just go to the mall or to go to my friend's house, something like that.
My phone is my life. I know that sounds quite shallow for an older generation, it's looked down upon quite a bit. My mother says to me now, if you arranged to go somewhere with a friend in the 60s and they didn't turn up, that was it. You went home and you wondered about it for another week until you saw them at school and you found out the reason why. But everything is so instant now.
In such an instant world, how do the older generation reflect on the extraordinary changes they've seen in their lifetime? What is progress and what is not? How do we weigh these things up?
I can always remember living in houses without any central heating at all, living in bedrooms in winter where there's ice on the inside the window. You can look at progress in two ways, the better progress and the worst of the progress.
Everything was done by hand. We didn't have electricity at home until about 59, I think it was. Now, everything is done by machine. People can go out all day now. They can just leave everything on, being done while they're out.
Times were hard, but you didn't think they were hard because it was the way you were brought up. You just took life as it was. But I still think as young people, we had a more satisfactory life than the young people have today.
I think sometimes it's worse, but other things are better. I think we chase too much and we try to get too much out of too little. I think we should sit back on our laurels a bit more and let things take their own natural way.
Listening to these voices lifts us above our daily distractions. It reminds us of who we are, where we're from, what we value and why it matters. It helps us link the past with the present and gives us a valuable resource for the future. For the volunteers working on this project, it's been a great privilege to record these stories. We'd like to thank all those who shared their lives with us and painted such a vibrant picture of a forgotten landscape.